Now, a little bit more in terms of contributions and, of course, changing mindsets as to how South Africans look to choose to retire comfortably. But let's understand the backdrop that we're doing this against. It's the macroeconomic climate in South Africa where things have proven to be tough, and as things have translated over the last few weeks, it's getting even tougher. So how is it then that we need to understand the ongoing international economic dynamics and how it translates into our investment portfolios for the long term? To give us our presentation on the economic overview, we're now joined by our next speaker who shares some insight as to where it is that South Africa as a country is headed. Ladies and gentlemen, to help us understand the lay of the economic landscape, please warmly welcome Professor Adrian Saville.
Gogo, thank you for the introduction and for welcoming me here. I'm Adrian Saville. Thank you for being with me. If you are human, which I hope you are, you will appreciate this as an opening storyboard. If you've had a moment to read through this, your human reaction is you will have read this first, then this, and finally this. And in ordinary times, this might elicit a chuckle. Perhaps in the current moment, it might elicit sort of some more sober reflection. Because we find ourselves in a time where humans are reacting in extraordinary ways to circumstance. And those reactions are fed by COVID-19, the March meltdown, oil prices collapsing from $50 to $25 in the space of days. And this has led to spectacular drama. In the 25 years that I've been managing money, I have never experienced a time like this, where we have 6 days in a row of the US market moving by at least 4% per day. US equities are down 30%, and we started the year at, believe it or not, 14 Rand to the dollar, and through the course of the last few days have touched 17.50 to the dollar. Reserve banks have responded in front foot ways. Spectacular policy actions coming out of the Federal Reserve, the ECB, and most recently the South African Reserve Bank, to speak about domestic context, cutting rates by 1%. As we go through the material that I've got to share with you, I will make reference to the current circumstance, to COVID-19, to the March meltdown, to the response, the impact, the implications of oil prices, economic growth, inflation, and so on. But in doing this, I want to remind us of our human reaction, that here is a chance for reflection and perspective. This is not in any way to remove or diminish the here and now of the events, but to remind us that this too shall pass. And I borrow here from Marty Linsky, who writes a widely documented Harvard Business Review article, widely read Harvard Business Review article. And his urging to us is to get off the dance floor and onto the balcony. And that by getting onto the balcony, we afford ourselves the chance of perspective, the opportunity of perspective. And it's that perspective that gives us the equipment for rational and prudent decision making, whether it is about life in general or investments in particular. There are three big stories that I'd like to share with you in the time we have together. The first is, what are the sources of risk? The second is, what are the big drivers that are going to shape and influence the environment, not over the next month or the next quarter or the next year, but the next decade? What will the world look like for our future selves, for our children? And the third is, what does this mean for South Africa? And how do we respond and react to these things, or anticipate to these things that are coming at us? So against the backdrop of those three big storyboards, the first one, what are the sources of risk? And staying with the theme of three, I'm going to suggest there are three core sources of risk. The first, borrowing from James Carville, who was Bill Clinton's presidential campaign advisor. James Carville says, it's the economy, stupid. one of the biggest sources of risk is the economy, the macro environment in which we find ourselves. Now, in more ordinary times, this might be a harder case to make. But if you take the events of the last month, I think this point is apparent and abundant, that the spectacular change that we have seen in the economic environment has translated into quite dramatic events for business, for industry, for economies, for societies. And we find in this economic environment or context story that one of the single biggest sources of influence on business performance is a single element called economic growth. To make this point about the single biggest source of risk being the economy, I'll take you away from South Africa, an easier argument to make than we talk about us and our circumstance and how we're doing. Let's talk about someone else for a moment. And the someone else that I'd like to talk about is Venezuela, where through the course of the noughties decade, Venezuela experienced extraordinary growth. In many cases, they were paraded as the poster child of economic development. This was how you should do it. If you wanted to be anyone in transforming your economy, you should emulate and mimic the story of Venezuela. Their case was afforded runway by an elevated oil price. If you take your minds back to the noughties decade, oil was trading around $100 a barrel. And if you are the largest oil reserve in the world, so there's a small factoid, the biggest oil reserve in the world is not in the Middle East, it's in Venezuela. And if you sit on the world's largest oil reserve and you have $100 oil coming at you, or revenue from $100 oil coming at you, you can have grand plans and spectacular social policy or social welfare impact. And this is exactly what Venezuela did using their $100 oil, putting in place universal healthcare, free universal education up to university level, and so on. Sadly, that changed, and that changed when the global financial crisis struck, oil prices collapsed, and they had to revisit their plans. However, they were afforded breathing room as oil prices found their way back to $70 and $80 a barrel. In recent times, though, in the space of the last couple of years, the oil price has fallen, and it has stayed lower for longer than Venezuela's budget plans had proposed or imagined. In response, this fast-growing, stable democracy did what unfortunately many policymakers do. They imagine it to be a different circumstance. So instead of putting in place strict, firm, clear shifts in their policy because of the changed environment, they kept all of their policy promises in place. And when they ran out of oil money, they went to their reserve bank and told their reserve bank, fire up the printing presses. And Venezuela initially kept their policy promises by printing the money. That has translated into an inflation rate in Venezuela of 1,000,000% per annum. Now, I mean, that's a bit of a stupid number. And if I tell you 1,000,000%, how do you even imagine that? So let me recalibrate 1,000,000% per annum inflation. The way you get 1,000,000% inflation per year is if prices double every day. So you buy a cold drink this afternoon for 10 Rand. Tomorrow afternoon, it's 20 Rand. Saturday, it's 40 Rand. 4 days later, it's 100 Rand. That is 100% inflation. Inflation is one of the surest ways to bankrupt a society. And that is exactly what has happened in the case of Venezuela, with their per-person income going from $1,000 up into middle income status and back to $1,000. It is an absolute tragedy. If you land up in a Venezuelan hospital, the result will be disaster. So we need to think here for a moment, or pause for a moment. Whilst South Africa is anxious about how our hospitals and how our healthcare system might cope with COVID, perhaps just for a moment, we can be thankful that we are not Venezuelan. Because if you arrive in a Venezuelan hospital, there are no medicines, there are no antibiotics, there are no ventilators. It is one of the surest paths to an ultimate destiny. So in fact, if you are headed to a Venezuelan hospital, you may rather want to head home. It's safer there. Risk two in this world is inside of economies, you have a range of industries. And the second biggest risk that we face is that the industries we are exposed to or invested in change their minds. A case in point here is the smartphone industry. And here you have data on the spectacular success, or what was the spectacular success of BlackBerry. The chart shows you the sales of BlackBerry's shipments, or BlackBerry's share of global shipments, which at one point reached almost 20%. 1 in 5 smartphones globally was a BlackBerry. And if we do a straw poll in any audience and ask who was a BlackBerry owner and user, it's a 1 in 2 number, because if we rewind 10 years, you were either on BlackBerry or Nokia. If we ask the same question today with a straw poll, who's a BlackBerry user, you might have 1 or 2 hand raisers. So here is a business that went from brilliant to broken in the space of just years. It is the second source of real investment risk. And technology is a pervasive force that is not going to go away anytime soon. The data that you see here is the time from technology introduction to market saturation. It's a beautiful piece of data. It spans over 100 years. And if we rewind 100 years, we find the cutting-edge technologies that are being brought to the home include things like electricity and the telephone. How long to get to market saturation? 30 and 40 years. We fast forward to current times, and the cutting-edge technologies that are being brought into environments include high-definition television, smartphones, mobile devices, and so on. How long to get from product launch to market saturation? Not 30 and 40 years, 30 and 40 months. So if you decide to react to a new technology, it's likely to be exactly that. It's a reaction, it's not an anticipation. And in all likelihood, it will be too late. The market has moved ahead of you, and you will have your BlackBerry moment. This is the second big source of investment risk. These disruptors, whilst they can be disruptors, can also be incredible and powerful drivers. The smartphone is a great case in point. And one of my favorite examples of this is Yoche, which is the Microsoft chatbot. It stands for, or means little ice when translated from Chinese. And Yoche you can find as a friend on your Chinese chat platform, the Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp. And when you go onto your chat platform and find Yoche, she's inside of your smart device. She knows your geo-mapping, so she knows where you are. She knows what time you went to sleep last night. She knows what time you woke up this morning. She can look at your calendar, and she can start to talk with you in rather intimate and connected ways. It's a great sort of storyboard of just how fast and spectacular disruption can be, because when I first started teaching this case study at the business school, not long ago, 2-3 years ago, I was sort of in awe of the fact that this chatbot had found 30 million users, and that the average interactions was 60 times a month. In other words, people were talking to the chatbot twice a day. You'll notice that the chatbot has been given gender, so we talk about Yoche as a she, and the community that speaks to Yoche has recently decided not only is a she, but she's 18 years old, because 18 years old is the age at which the world is your oyster. You are fully adult, and your responsibility is approximately 0. You're accountable to no one other than yourself. So they've decided that A, Yoche is a she, and B, she is 18 years old. Now, from then to now, when I first started teaching this case, to now, 2-3 years, the subscribers to Yoche, the chatters of Yoche, is a population that has grown exponentially. Here's what Yoche looks like, and her subscriber, her followers now rank at more than 600 million people who speak to Yoche on chat lines. She has started to paint because she has learnt the painting skills of 30 master painters. She has a radio show. She's done a video, a music video, and perhaps for people watching this storyboard, there is a wow moment because Yolche has started to give financial perspective. She's not giving advice, and I want to say yet. She's not giving advice, but rather she is making commentary on financial events through a news channel called Wind in China, generating multiple reports based on financial information. The third source of risk, and so that second source of risk is not going to go away anytime soon. In fact, it's likely to follow the historical convention of accelerating with greater speed and impact. The third source of risk is, well, life in general. And here I'm going to borrow, not from an obvious source, but from one of my favorite commentators on this life in general getting in the way, and it's Mike Tyson, who says everyone has a plan till you get punched in the mouth, or to quote him more exactly, he says everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. And I think Tyson has a powerful point here in this environment, because the punch in the mouth that has hit us is COVID-19. Rewind to the beginning of this year and find investment commentary or market commentary or political commentary or even social narrative that is talking about COVID-19. It wasn't on the radar. And in the space of 8 weeks, it has gone from being sort of a quirky, trivial observation to a landscape changer. COVID-19 has become the story of 2020. These risks just jump out. It's called life getting in the way of plans. Now, COVID-19 has turned many people into instant medical experts, and I'm not going to make any effort to try and claim that type of knowledge or expertise. We will draw knowledge, insight, information from others to make some sense of the environment, the impact, the risks that we face here. And so rather than try and sort of figure out just how big this is or how vulnerable or prone any of us are to this epidemic or pandemic, let me rather try and walk around in water or an arena with which I'm far more comfortable and intimate, and that is the likely economic and industrial impacts. Our tough times in this economy have just become tougher, and COVID-19 is one of those sources of impact. So what will this mean? My argument in this environment is this too shall pass. And there are ways in which people are responding and reacting. There are material industry implications. The most obvious example of industry implication is the airline industry, where Scandinavian Airlines over this past weekend retrenched or laid off temporarily, and now I want to use inverted air commas, they laid off 90% of their workforce because of an absolute shutdown in airline traffic. The oil price has responded because as COVID-19 has translated into a sharp and sudden slowdown in economic growth, oil producers, including Venezuela, have continued to pump oil, which meant we were getting into a world of abundant oil, too much oil. And that surplus oil starts to put downward pressure on oil prices. The Saudis and Russia went into discussion about how they would manage this under their OPEC plus arrangement, and neither of them blinked at the poker table, and they both continued pumping. The result is that oil has moved from $50 a barrel to $25 a barrel. And now perhaps the suggestion is, well, not only can we be thankful that we're not Venezuelan, maybe we can also be thankful that we are not Turkish or any other important oil, Mexican, any other important oil producer, because their single biggest source of revenue has just fallen by 50%. So if those are the three biggest risks, let me take you back to the balcony and ask you about three big drivers, or suggest to you about three big drivers. And the game that I would play with you is to ask you, what do you think is going to shape the world over the next decade? Let me move away from the world where many economists spend a lot of their time talking about forecasts to one decimal place, and instead speak about the structural drivers over the next decade. And here, just like my risks, I want to share with you thoughts on three big structural drivers. The first structural driver is, yes, COVID will have an impact on old age populations, but the impact is modest, it is marginal. And the world is likely to get older over the next 10 years. Second, we have falling fertility rates, fewer babies per person in the world. And third, we have more machines. So older people, fewer babies, more machines are three big balcony drivers, to coin a term. The first one about more people. This is the consequence of rising life expectancy, improved healthcare, better science, better medicine. And the data that you see here is life expectancies versus retirement age. Life expectancy, because this is about how long we can expect to go for on average. But there is a financial point here for all of us in this audience, for investment managers, for actuaries, for advisors, and for retirees or people planning to retire, which I suspect is all of us one day. Is we will live much longer than we anticipate. Rewind to the 1970s, life expectancy was 60-something years old. Retirement age was also 60-something years, which meant quite conveniently for actuaries and financial advisors, and in fact for our pension funds, we died around the age that we retired. You talk about dying on the job. And that's exactly what this data shows us, that in fact, in the 1970s, life expectancy was slightly below retirement age. But from then to now, things have changed spectacularly. That life expectancy has continued to march steadily higher. Approximately for every 4 years of life, we get 1 year of expectancy added. And that's a fairly steady progression in medicine and science, but retirement ages and practices haven't changed. The expectation is still that we will retire at 65, which means for people planning on retiring at 65 that you can square up for 10, 15, 20 years in retirement. And you may not have financially equipped yourself for that. Malusi and Andrew make this point in their presentation. As an economist, perhaps my work is cut out here because we're supposed to be depressing if I think about their stats. I mean, that's the really depressing stuff, is what is the chance of you living a long time to the extent that you outlive your money? And the odds are increasingly in favor of that outcome. In this environment, the increasing likelihood, and one could argue risk, is that you live far longer than you had anticipated. The data suggests that in OECD countries, life expectancy now sits comfortably in 80 years for most of those OECD countries. That in turn has implications for pensioners, for people saving for retirement, for investment managers, and for advisors. The implication is this: you stand an overwhelmingly good chance of running out of money. OECD country data shows that average life expectancy in retirement now sits at approximately 18 years. Average money available for retirement sits at about 10 years, which means the last 8 years of your life in retirement will be spent without your own money and on someone else's dime. Who is that someone else? Well, it's likely to be children rather than the state. So there is a really interesting social dynamic there, and here with bad humor, I'll tell you terrifyingly that not only are my parents in exceptionally good health, but so are my in-laws. And so the reality for us statistically is that we land up with 4 different parents retiring comfortably into our home, and that in turn has knock-on and spillover effects. With bad humor aside, let me go to the second big balcony driver, and that is fewer babies. The data that you see here is a number of babies born per adult woman in the 1950s. And to give you some sense, to make sense of these numbers, for a population to grow, it needs more than 2.2 babies per adult woman. That magical number 2.2 is what we call the replacement ratio. So any country that has more than 2.2 babies per adult woman is going to experience population growth. And the reds and the yellows here show you the countries around the world that are experiencing population growth in the 1950s. In fact, it is most places, and certainly most populous places, that are experiencing population growth. Fast forward 35 years to 1985, and the world has become less red and orange and more blue and green, which means population growth rates are starting to slow, that there are fewer babies per adult woman. And the countries with blues and greens are going into the sub 2.2 babies per adult woman range. That's 1985. 2020, most of the world is below population replacement ratio. In other words, most of the world now is in an environment in which populations are shrinking. So there is a fear, there is an anxiety, there is a collective perception that we live in a world in which there are more and more and more people, and eventually the planet will run out of space. That isn't quite the statistical reality. The statistical reality is that most countries now are into the environment of shrinking, with some populations actually shrinking very quickly, including the likes of Japan, Taiwan, and although Italy might seem to be a convenient example, given the spectacularly dramatic impact of COVID, Italy, before COVID, already had a fast shrinking and aging population. The third thing that we anticipate to be a powerful structural driver when seen from the balcony over the next 10 years is technology, and more explicitly, machines. Now here, it is quite easy to be intimidated and confused because there's lots of jargon, and when we talk about one component, people often suspect that it is the entire entity, but there are quite distinct attributes or aspects here when I use the term machines. And the distinct aspects include, amongst other things, robots, which are machines that can automate. Machines that can learn, which start to gather or take on the form of artificial intelligence. And then big data, where you can go and learn stuff that to the naked eye or at first blush may not seem obvious or evident. So when talking about robots and machines, I think we first need to be careful in distinguishing between artificial intelligence, robots, machine learning, big data, and so on. And perhaps that's a conference all of itself. What I want to dwell on here for a moment is imagining the possibilities, the spectacular possibilities that come about as a result of this. One of my favorite examples is DNA sequencing. My son is born in 2006, where I could have had him DNA sequenced had I had a couple of $1 million lying around. That was the cost. So DNA sequencing was first commercially available in 2007. It would set you back a fair chunk of money, and so it's really an academic point that you could DNA sequence someone in 2007. Academically, you could do it. In practice, you couldn't. The reality is today, by this being an exponential technology, the cost of DNA sequencing has fallen dramatically, so that you can now DNA sequence yourself or your child for just $100. And that DNA sequencing starts to evidence or demonstrate various risks and vulnerabilities that we historically have been oblivious to. Now, for religious, ethical, or fatalistic reasons, you may not want to DNA sequence yourself. You might just want to get on with it and see where it all lands up. But if you want information, intelligence, insight on yourself, on your fate, on risks that you face, and this has all types of implications, for instance, for insurers and actuaries, then DNA sequencing is commercially available at just $100. few industries have immunity here. And we can speak about the impact and implication of machines for investment managers. And the evidence that we have is that machines are actually quite good at managing money. In fact, machines might be better at managing money than investment managers. Lawyers are arguably some part of their industry is at risk. There's a lovely example that I share with you here of an artificial intelligence that has learned to read non-disclosure agreements, which many lawyers would describe as very dull and dry work. The artificial intelligence, it takes lawyers the better part of 2 hours to get through the non-disclosure agreements. It takes the artificial intelligence 26 seconds to get through the agreements. And if you are a lawyer and you can speed up your work pace to get through the NDAs in 26 seconds, then perhaps you stand a chance. The reality is, here is a version of COVID. You know, we think about the impacts COVID has had. It's like, wow, this is dramatic for the leisure industry, the airline industry. But it's happening in other places. For instance, lawyers being displaced by machines who are reading non-disclosure agreements. This is a variation on that risk. In the insurance industry, here's another spectacular example. The world record is set by Lemonade in insurance claim settlements. 3 seconds to settle an insurance claim. Because using the smart device, the smartphone gathers all types of information, which through machine learning becomes knowledge, and then it tells the insurer about people's wake times, sleep times, driving behavior. And so that when I submit a claim, I'm submitting it to an insurer that actually knows, without asking me any questions, that I go to sleep at 10, I'm up at 5, that I'm at gym 6 days a week, and I'm probably a great insurable risk. And so when I put in a claim, they want to keep me as a client, and they settle that claim in 3 seconds. So machines, robots, data are likely to have all types of implications. In some places, they will be great disruptors, and in other instances, they will be powerful drivers. For instance, think of robotic surgery, where in the 1960s, Arthur C. Clarke said, it is almost unimaginable in the 1960s. Arthur C. Clarke says there will come a time when a surgeon in Edinburgh will be able to operate or perform a procedure on a patient in New Zealand. That seemed just bizarre, outlandish, impossible in the 1960s. We were yet to put a person on the moon. And here we are, where robotic surgery, remote surgery, is a common day, ordinary event in 2020. So the machines mean magic. This doesn't make all machines smart. Some machines can do quite foolish things or quirky things. And to give you a couple of rather interesting examples, we have the case of a machine that was told to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And it was given parts to assemble itself. And those parts included arms, legs. It could create a spine or a backbone. And then it could figure out how to assemble itself to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And the way it got from point A to point B was by stacking itself as tall as it could and then falling over. And its head fell onto point B. So yeah, okay, I got you the result. But it's not quite what the engineers or the architects of the machine solution imagined. Another example is of a robot that was taught how to make pancakes, and one of the tips that the robot was given was that the longer the pancake spins in the air while it's being flipped, the better the pancake. And so this robot scoops up the pancake and flings the pancake as far as it can across the room. Lots of airtime travel, not quite the anticipated result. And then a robotic Hoover that was told, it's called a Roomba. The Roomba was told that the best way to clean a room is to make sure that it doesn't bump into anything, that its sensors mustn't bump into any furniture. And so guess what the Roomba learned to do? It learned to drive backwards because it doesn't have any sensors on the back. So the Roomba cleans the room backwards. So now, I mean, these are sort of quirky examples, almost anecdotes that I'm sharing with you. But I think I hope that they make the powerful point that until we know how the machine behaves, We shouldn't be in awe of machines, and we also shouldn't be intimidated by it. My argument to you is actually not me or the machine, it's me and the machine. And one of my favorite cases in point comes from Boston Dynamics. If you've received an Amazon package, it was probably put together by a robot as opposed to sweatshop labor. And how about robots that can go into burning buildings and rescue people out of burning buildings? The machine can do this. And these are just some examples of demonstration of me and the machine rather than me or the machine. So the third thing I promised to talk to you about was us. What about us? And having got onto the balcony, perhaps we can use this perspective now in having a sense of the risks and in having a sense of the structural drivers. We can now talk about us. So how do things look for South Africa? If we stood on Mars and we looked at the prospects for the world economy, the heat map suggests South Africa is sort of on the fainter edge of the colors. There are some countries that are deeply in the red, experiencing sharp negative growth. Argentina, the Sudan would be cases in point. South Africa is having a hard time getting any shape of deep blue, which means impressive growth, robust growth, growth that is worth talking about. So the bad jokers, here's a picture of our president, our former president and vice president, and this had a damaging, devastating and deep lasting impact on the South African economy. I don't think that this needs much evidencing, but for the better part of the last 10 years, the South African economy, for all intents and purposes, has been in stall mode. Our per-person incomes are exactly the same today that they were in 2010. But let's just stall there for a moment and think about what South Africa felt like in 2010. Imagine this. In 2010, we were about to host the Soccer World Cup. The rand was 7 rand to the dollar, and economic growth was at 3%. 10 years can be a long time. In politics, 10 years can be a long time in economics. 10 years can be a long time in capital markets. And the way that policymakers have responded to South Africa's stalled state is, perhaps to my dismay, they have become increasingly busy. The data that you see here is what I would venture is an attempt to engineer South Africa into stronger shape, but it's quite dismaying. The purple column here shows you South Africa's ease of doing business. 10 years ago, we ranked 32nd in the world. Today, we rank 84th in the world. The blue column is Rwanda's ease of doing business. And Rwanda has gone from one of the hardest places in the world to do business, 143rd, and they have overtaken and now comfortably surpassed South Africa to be one of the easiest places in the world to do business. If you want to get a visa, you don't need one to go to Rwanda. In fact, you can arrive at the airport, fill out the visa on your smartphone and be processed in minutes, clear customs, and you're in Kigali, where you will find some of the cheapest and fastest data, not in Africa, in the world. On top of getting in our own way in making the ease of doing business much more difficult than it was 10 years ago, we also have a number of specific risks that face South Africa. Here are 3 of them. The first specific risk is our population is young. If we had a fast-growing economy with labor-absorbing growth and rising productivity, this is what we could call perhaps a demographic dividend. Instead, it is squaring itself up as a demographic risk that half of our population is younger than 25 years old. The second worrying component of South Africa's structural makeup is that we rank as one of the most unequal countries in the world. Whether you use balance sheet inequality, income statement inequality, or access to education inequality, or commute time to work inequality, South Africa ranks as one of the most unequal societies in the world. And then we have the third component, which is unemployment, and more exactly, youth unemployment. So it's all good and well that Stats SA talks about South Africa having 29.1% unemployment. I wonder aloud why we even bother about the 0.1 number. There is a 2 in the front of that figure. And then, buried just below the surface of that 29.1 overall unemployment rate, we have a youth unemployment rate that is approaching 60%. 1 in 2 young people in South Africa is unemployed. Put those 3 ingredients together, young, unequal, and unemployed, and what do you have? You have the common ingredients of the Arab Spring of 10 years ago. South Africa has exactly those 3 ingredients in even more powerful combinations than those Arab Spring countries had 10 years ago. If that is the reality that South Africa faces, I think that it is fair to suggest that our tough times have just got tougher, and that the track record behind the policy promises is underwhelming, that the policy promises encouragingly have stayed fairly consistent, 5-point-something% economic growth, but the policy delivery has got more and more distant from that promise. Something has to change in this environment. For companies, this also means a challenging landscape. Shifting technologies, demanding industry dynamics. We've given some of the impacts, and we've seen some quite extraordinary fallout in the space of weeks, forget about years, in the energy sector, for example, where the oil price falling from $50 to $25 has put one of South Africa's large industrial businesses under extraordinary financial pressure. And then broader industries, the travel industry, the tourism industry, leisure industry, have also come under pressure as a consequence of COVID-19. And then as a broad collective business feeling the challenge, the pain, the difficulty of stalled economic growth. For a moment now, I'm going to do something unusual. I'm going to be upbeat for an economist, and I'm going to ask you to suspend your disbelief. If we went back 6 months and I said to you, imagine this, we will have a royal couple addressed by one of our rugby players in his underpants, wearing the South African flag underpants, never going to happen. And look where we are. They've shifted industry. We've got the silverware, and we've also got the photograph. So the unimaginable can happen. And here are some attributes or aspects of unimaginable that I think are realistic, because there is a danger of being optimistic and naive. I think that's a powerful cocktail for disaster. So here are some more buoyant points in a tough environment, but realistic buoyant points. The first point of buoyancy, realistic optimism, is that we're not Venezuela. South Africa has an entrenched, established institutions, strong fabric in our institutional infrastructure. An example of that strong fabric is the people listening on this presentation. The pension fund industry is my case in point, that we have one of the highest levels of pension fund asset relative to GDP of any country in the world. It is an established, sophisticated industry, and a small nudge to shift this industry's behavior from financial investment to impact investment, and you get a sense of just how powerful this force can be. A second piece of good news is the world is not flat. Now that seems to be a rather perverse point to be making in this environment where everyone's putting up borders and shutting down travel. But to go back to an earlier argument that I was making, this too shall pass. And when it passes, we live in the second fastest growing region in the world. And you may well argue, oh yeah, but now the shutdown is going to do this, and travel restrictions are going to do that, and travel bans and quarantining are going to have all types of implications for certain industries. Absolutely. So did the global financial crisis. And it passed. And when it passed, this second fastest growing region in the world resumed its growth trajectory, and that second fastest growing region is Sub-Saharan Africa. From 2000 to now, Sub-Saharan Africa has grown 1.5% faster than the rest of the world, and the two fastest growing countries in the world are Sub-Saharan African over the last 20 years. And those countries are Ethiopia and Rwanda, which are not running along, sprinting along at 9 and 7% economic growth. They are likely to feel damage, impact, as a result of the recent economic slowdown, and they are likely to retain their status as fast-growing economies. By way of example, Ethiopia has resolved long-standing border conflict. They've invited foreign capital in to invest into strategic industries, including finance and travel, and they are building one of the world's largest transport hubs, and that's just outside of Addis, where they are building an airport, $5 billion investment to handle traffic of 100 million passengers per annum. How big is 100 million passengers per annum? It's Heathrow. Ethiopia is building Heathrow. And this does feel like a difficult example to make in this moment where no one is traveling. But to make the point again, even to make the point ad nauseam, this will pass. And when it passes, Ethiopia has squared up to the world, setting itself up as an industrial and transport hub. The line that you see here is Ethiopia's air passenger traffic from 2007 to 2019. In 2007, Ethiopian Airlines carried 2 million passengers. In 2019, Ethiopian Airlines carried 12 million passengers. That's a 6-fold increase in Ethiopia Airlines passenger traffic in just over 10 years. If you want the most modern airline fleet in the world, it's Ethiopian Airlines. And if you want a comparator, a sense of perspective, a balcony moment, what have we done as the home of South African Airways over the same period? Well, the data shows you here, South African Airways, 7 million passengers down to 6 million passengers over the same time that Ethiopian Airlines went from 2 million to 12 million. So perhaps it's not the environment, it's what you do with that environment. My third piece of good news is that we are human. To go back to the very early argument where I played sort of a game with you about our behaviors. One of those behaviors in being human is that we are entrepreneurial, that we are inventive, that we are industrious. And I've already made the point about the powerful financial capital that sits in this environment of the likes of Old Mutual Superfund. What if we mobilize that capital in different ways? Could be one question. And what if we thought about mobilizing capital in different ways? Is another aspect. By way of example, Chile undertook South Africa's equivalent of an RDP program, building houses. The houses that they handed over to new owners, though, was not a fully assembled house. It was half a house. Why half a house? Because the other half is like a geared balance sheet. It allows the new owner to actually build into that structure and invest into the home, rather than take a fully assembled, fully capitalized home. Here's half a home. You build out the rest. You build it out in a way that suits you, that suits your circumstance, that can grow with your income and your balance sheet. In order to receive this half a house, the recipient had to show stable, sensible savings behavior, that they had to have opened a bank account, put monthly savings into that bank account over 3 years, and accumulated a modest but consistent deposit through their savings behavior. And this is not only a way in which financial capital can have impact, but it can help those who have now been included in the financial system climb the financial ladder. And I think our humanness demonstrates things that are possible. And these aren't wild, spectacular, imaginative possibilities. They are very real possibilities. So we have to turn all of this into action. Otherwise, it's just, well, hopefully it's a great piece of material to work with, really interesting content, but none of it matters unless we turn this into action. So here are a couple of thoughts of the investment implication. Allowing for the recent market sell-off, it remains the case that Apple, a single company, is worth more than the whole of the German stock exchange. And if you invest in the German stock exchange, what are you going to get through that investment? You're going to be invested in some of the world's biggest chemicals businesses that provides active ingredients to pharmaceutical businesses. You'll be invested in some of the world's biggest healthcare businesses, and you will be invested in some big tech businesses. BASF, BMW, VW would be cases in point. So you could take a single bet on a business like Apple, or you could take a bet on an entire country like Germany. And if we take the industriousness, the productivity, the demographic structure, the neighborhood, I would suggest that here is a sensible way to think about capital allocation in this 10-year world of the big balcony drivers. A second example of a way in which we could convert ideas into action comes from Jack Ma. Jack Ma cautions us. He says, or he cautions the world. He says to Alibaba and eBay, he says, you might be the shark in the ocean. I'm the crocodile in the Yangtze River. If you come here, you better know what I'm capable of and what the rules are. Alibaba's revenue this year is bigger than eBay and Amazon combined. And this has been done in a spectacularly short space of time. Jack Ma establishes Alibaba in 1998. And from 1998 to now, he has built one of the largest businesses in the world. The data that you see here, from 1998 to now, he has built the 7th largest business in the world. The data that you see here is an anecdote for that size. The orange column shows you Alibaba's sales on Singles Day. Singles Day is China's equivalent of Cyber Monday, where people are encouraged to go online and buy themselves something nice. In 2009, what Alibaba sold on Singles Day was just $10 million of online sales. 2019, they do $38 billion of sales. That $38 billion of sales from a single company dwarfs the entire figure for the United States, the whole of the United States, $9.4 billion. As a quirky aside, Singles Day happens every year on the 11th of November because Jack Ma says the 11th of November, the date 11/11, is 1111. He says this is the loneliest day of the year, all the singles. So if you're quarantined, take confidence. And then we could bring all of this home because here is a business that has changed itself over the last 10 years. If you think about what Germany has done over 10 years, what Alibaba has done over 10 years, and now perhaps what a South African business, Ltron, has done over 10 years. 10 years ago, Ltron was an asset-heavy, clunky, stodgy balance sheet business filled with industrial and engineering capabilities, but not filled with profit. And in fact, in the early parts of the noughties decade, Ltron started to make quite steep losses. Over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, under Mteto Nyati, the former CEO of MTN Africa, Ltron has transformed itself. It has built now a third of its revenue outside of South Africa. A third of its revenue comes from a very annuity-based business, Netstar, and it has shifted its balance sheet from being heavy and engineering to light and technology-based. Ltron has moved itself from the ground into the cloud. It's moved from loss-making 5 years ago into a return on equity and a return on assets that sits comfortably in double digits. In fact, in its most recent financial statements, Ltron's return on equity sat comfortably in the 20%. Their undertaking is over 5 years, they will double their EBITDA from 2017 to 2022, and they are comfortably on their way to achieve that. If you take the existing market environment, you can buy Ltron on a very elevated dividend yield and a undemanding price earnings multiple, and yes, earnings will be challenged in this environment, but those earnings are now supported by a strong balance sheet that has been rid of its debt or freed of its indebtedness over the last couple of years. So these are some ways in which we can turn these arguments into action and turn powerful drivers into investment deliverers. Thank you for being with me.